The hum of the extractor fan was a constant companion, a low thrum that vibrated through the soles of Seth's boots and up into his teeth. It was the sound of survival, the sound of recycled air keeping them alive in this metal womb buried beneath the lunar surface. A colleague Motes danced in the artificial light, mimicking stars in a miniature contained cosmos. Seth checked the chrono. Another rotation done. Another rotation closer to going home. He ran a gloved hand over the smooth, cold surface of the control panel, the metal slick with condensation. Lunar mining wasn't glamorous. It was monotonous, isolating, and relentlessly gray. But it paid well. An agent to forget the gray when he was back on Earth, breathing real air and feeling the sun on his skin. He glanced at the monitors, a grid of flickering readouts displaying the status of the mining operation. A guard nominal. For now. A figure the alarm blared. A harsh, insistent shriek that cut through the hum and sent a jolt of adrenaline through Seth's system. A person lights flashed, bathing the control room in an ominous glow. "What the hell?" Seth muttered, stabbing at the silence button. The shriek died, leaving a ringing emptiness in its wake. On the primary monitor, one of the mining drones was flashing a critical error. "Drone 7 offline," a voice crackled over the comms. It was the technician, his voice tight with anxiety. "Lost connection. No telemetry." Seth frowned. Drone 7 was operating in Sector 4, the newly opened vein. "Try a hard reset," he instructed. "Could be a software glitch." A pause. Then, "Tried that. No response. It's completely dead." Damn it. Sector 4 had been yielding promising results. A witness in helium-3, but also something else. Something unusual. A mineral they hadn't seen before. Shimmering, almost iridescent, embedded in the lunar rock like frozen starlight. They'd started calling it Moonstone. "Send a recovery team," Seth said. "Find out what happened to Drone 7, and tell them to be careful." He watched as the technician dispatched a team. The silence stretched, broken only by the hum of the fans and the frantic tapping of keys. He had a bad feeling churning in his gut. An officer wasn't right. A detective that rotation. The recovery team returned. They found Drone 7 lying on its side, its metallic shell twisted and warped. It looked like something had crushed it. "Anything unusual?" Seth asked the officer, his voice tight. The officer hesitated. "There was a residue on the drone, a specialist dust, like the Moonstone, but finer. A technician, like scales." "Scales?" Seth exchanged a worried glance with the technician. "And," the officer continued, his voice barely a whisper, "one of the team. He said he saw something. A colleague of the corner of his vision. A shadow. An agent too fast to be real." Seth sighed. "Lunar fever," he said, trying to sound reassuring. "It's just fatigue, a guard oxygen, a figure him to get some rest." But even as he said the words, a chill ran down his spine. He remembered the way the person had glowed faintly under the harsh glare of the mining lights. A subtle, ethereal luminescence that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. That night, Seth couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in his bunk. The image of the twisted drone and the shimmering dust burned into his mind. The air in the bunker felt thick, heavy. He could hear the low hum of the fans, but it was overlaid with another sound. A faint, almost imperceptible scratching. He sat up, his heart pounding. The scratching stopped. He strained his ears, listening. Nothing. He told himself it was just the ventilation system, or maybe one of the other crew members, restless like him. But as he lay back down, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something was lurking in the shadows just beyond the edge of his perception. He pulled the thin blanket tighter around himself, the rough fabric scratching against his skin. The air tasted metallic, and he thought he saw a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. He blinked, and it was gone. A witness wouldn't come. The scratching didn't come again, but the oppressive atmosphere in the tiny bunk room didn't dissipate. The air tasted like ozone and old metal. Seth stared at the ceiling, tracing the lines of the ventilation ducts with his eyes. He needed to get some sleep. He had to be sharp for the morning shift. But the image of the colleague 7, crushed and lifeless, kept replaying in his mind. He finally drifted off into a fitful sleep, plagued by strange dreams. An agent of shimmering dust and shadows that danced just beyond his grasp. He woke with a start, his heart hammering against his ribs. The chrono read 05 to 0, a guard to get up. The mess hall was almost empty. A technician was hunched over a mug of synth coffee, his face pale and drawn. He looked up as Seth approached. "Morning," Seth said, trying to sound cheerful. The technician just grunted in response. The aroma of recycled protein paste filled the air, a smell Seth had grown to despise. "Anything to report?" Seth asked. "Power fluctuations," the technician said, his voice flat. "Sector 3, a figure losing voltage. I've rerouted power from auxiliary, but it's not a permanent fix." Seth sighed. A person problem. "Anything else?" The technician hesitated. "Some of the others. They're saying they're seeing things, a witness things." "Lunar fever," Seth said dismissively. "It'll pass." He grabbed a tray of protein paste and sat down at a table. The texture was slimy and tasteless. He forced himself to swallow it. "It's not just fatigue," the technician insisted. "It's different. They're saying the moonstone is affecting them." Seth frowned. The moonstone is just a mineral. It can't affect anyone. He knew he sounded unconvincing, even to himself. The technician shrugged. "Just telling you what I heard." He finished his coffee and walked away. Seth finished his breakfast in silence, the technician's words echoing in his mind. He tried to dismiss them as paranoia, stress, the effects of long-term isolation. But a seed of doubt had been planted. He spent the morning troubleshooting the power fluctuations in Sector 3. The problem was intermittent and difficult to trace. He checked the wiring, the generators, the distribution panels. Our officers seemed to be in order, but the voltage kept dropping, spiking erratically. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of his vision, a detective that flickered and danced in the periphery. He told himself it was just his imagination, a result of fatigue and stress. But the feeling persisted. A specialist in the afternoon, one of the mining crew found a colleague. He was in his bunk, curled up in a fetal position, muttering incoherently. His skin was pale and clammy, and his eyes were wide with terror. "He's not making sense," the officer reported to Seth. "He keeps talking about whispers from the light." Seth went to the bunk room. The air was thick with the stench of sweat and fear. The colleague was lying on his bunk, his body trembling. He was muttering something, but Seth couldn't make out the words. Seth knelt beside him. "Hey," he said gently. "It's all right. You're safe." The colleague looked up at him, his eyes filled with a bottomless dread. "The light," he whispered. "It's talking to me." Seth examined him more closely. That's when he saw it. On the colleague's forearm, faint, iridescent patterns were appearing on his skin. A technician's scales, but shimmering with an unnatural light. The same light as the moonstone. A chill ran down Seth's spine. This wasn't lunar fever. This was something else. Something far more sinister. Something connected to the moonstone. A sense of dread washed over him, cold and heavy. He suddenly felt very, very alone. The hum of the extractor fan seemed to grow louder, pressing in on him, suffocating him. The air tasted metallic, and the faint scratching sound returned, closer this time. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that whatever was happening here was only just beginning. Seth stared at the iridescent scales forming on the colleague's arm. They pulsed with a soft, internal light, casting strange shadows on the bunkroom walls. The metallic taste in the air intensified, coating his tongue. "The light," the colleague repeated, his voice cracking. "It wants to change me." Seth grabbed the officer by the arm, pulling him out of the bunkroom. "Seal the door," he barked. "Now." The officer hesitated, glancing back at the colleague. "But, seal it," Seth roared, his voice echoing in the narrow corridor. The officer, startled by the uncharacteristic outburst, fumbled with the control panel and slammed the door shut, engaging the locking mechanism. A red light flashed above the entrance. Seth leaned against the cold metal wall, his heart pounding in his chest. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to process what he had just seen. It was impossible. The colleague was just a mineral. It couldn't cause physical transformations. Agent it? The scratching sound returned, louder this time, emanating from behind the sealed door. It was accompanied by a series of sickening thuds, as if something was slamming against the metal. "What's happening to him?" the officer asked, his voice trembling. Seth didn't answer. He didn't know, but he knew that they were in serious trouble. "We need to contain him," Seth said, his mind racing. "Get the security chief. Guard him what you saw and tell him to bring weapons." The officer nodded and hurried away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Seth stood alone in front of the sealed door, listening to the sounds of the colleague's struggle. The scratching grew more frantic, the thuds more violent. He could hear a low, guttural growl coming from inside the bunkroom. It was no longer the voice of a man. He activated his comm unit. "Seth to security chief. Respond." A crackling voice came over the comm. "Security chief here. What's the situation?" "We have a situation in bunkroom C4, Seth said, his voice tight. "A colleague has been affected by something. He's undergoing a physical transformation. He's contained, but we need backup and weapons." There was a pause. "Transformation? What are you talking about?" "I don't have time to explain," Seth said. "Just get here, now." He deactivated the comm and waited, his hand resting on the access panel beside the door. The scratching stopped. The thuds ceased. The only sound was the low growl, which seemed to be getting closer. Suddenly, the door buckled inward, the metal groaning under immense pressure. A section of the door ripped away, revealing a gaping hole. A figure the opening, Seth could see the colleague. But it was no longer the colleague he knew. The figure was hunched over, its limbs twisted and elongated. Its skin was covered in thick, chitinous plates that shimmered with the same iridescent light as the moonstone. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural intensity. A person extra limbs sprouted from its back. The creature lunged at the opening, its claws scraping against the metal. Seth stumbled backward, his heart leaping into his throat. The security chief arrived, followed by 2 security personnel, their weapons raised. "What the hell is that?" the security chief exclaimed, his face pale with shock. "It's the colleague," Seth said, his voice barely a whisper. "He's been transformed." The creature roared, a sound that echoed through the corridor and charged at the security team. The security personnel opened fire, their weapons spitting streams of energy. The bolts struck the creature, but they seemed to have little effect. The chitinous plates deflected the energy, causing it to dissipate harmlessly. The creature swatted one of the security personnel aside, sending him sprawling against the wall. It turned its attention to the security chief, who stood frozen in place, his eyes wide with terror. Seth knew he had to do something. He grabbed a nearby metal pipe and charged at the creature, swinging the pipe with all his might. The pipe connected with the creature's head, producing a sickening crack. The creature staggered backward, momentarily stunned. Seth didn't hesitate. He swung the pipe again and again, driving the creature back into the bunk room. The security chief, snapping out of his stupor, joined the attack, firing his weapon at the creature's exposed limbs. The creature roared in pain and rage. It lashed out with its claws, tearing at the walls and ceiling. A witness of plaster and metal rained down on them. As Seth fought, he noticed something strange. The creature's movements were jerky and uncoordinated. It seemed to be struggling against its own body. And in its eyes, he saw a flicker of something familiar. A spark of the Colleague 7's humanity. A glint of confusion and fear. The creature emitted a high-pitched whine. It clutched its head with one of its many limbs, its body convulsing. It was as if it was fighting a war within itself. Then, the creature collapsed to the floor, its body writhing in agony. The iridescent light faded from its skin. The chitinous plates softened and began to retract. The colleague, the officer, was changing back. The colleague writhed, the guttural sounds replaced by choked gasps. Seth lowered the pipe, his breath coming in ragged bursts. The security chief, still shaken, kept his weapon trained on the convulsing form. The air hung thick with the metallic tang, sharper now, almost burning the back of Seth's throat. The officer, who had fled to get help, reappeared, his face etched with horror. He stared at the scene, unable to speak. Seth gestured him back. "Keep your distance." He didn't know what would happen next, or if the transformation was truly over. Slowly, agonizingly, the colleague's body returned to its original shape. The chitinous plates vanished, leaving behind raw, bleeding skin. The extra limbs receded, leaving only scars. The iridescent glow faded, replaced by the pale, clammy sheen of sweat. He lay on the floor, naked and shivering, his eyes wide with terror. "Get him some blankets," Seth said, his voice hoarse, "and seal off this entire section." He turned to the security chief. "I want a full lockdown of the colony, no one in or out, and I want all moonstone samples secured immediately." The security chief nodded, barking orders at the security personnel. The officer helped the colleague to his feet, supporting him as they moved toward the bunks. Seth watched them go, his mind reeling. What he had just witnessed defied all logic, all reason. It was something out of a nightmare. He activated his comm unit. "Seth to all personnel. This is a code red lockdown. A colleague personnel are to report to their designated quarantine zones. No exceptions. I repeat, this is a code red lockdown." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "And I want all available scientists to report to the lab. We need to understand what the hell is going on here." The metallic scent in the air seemed to intensify, a constant sickening reminder of what had just transpired. Seth ran a hand through his hair, feeling the grit of lunar dust between his fingers. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. He made his way to the lab, his boots echoing on the metal floor. The colony was eerily silent, the usual hum of machinery replaced by a tense, expectant quiet. He could almost feel the weight of the lunar surface pressing down on them, isolating them from the rest of humanity. Agent the lab, the air was sterile and cold. Guard lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the equipment. Seth walked over to the containment unit where the moonstone samples were stored. They shimmered, even behind the reinforced glass, pulsing with a faint internal light. He activated the analysis equipment, his fingers flying over the controls. He needed to know everything about this mineral, its composition, its structure, its properties. There had to be something, some clue, that could explain what had happened to the Colleague 7. As the analysis ran, Seth noticed something odd. A low hum, almost imperceptible, emanated from the moonstone. It vibrated through the floor, through his bones, a subtle, unsettling resonance. He adjusted the equipment, amplifying the sound. It was a frequency he couldn't quite place, almost subliminal. He turned to the microscope, focusing on a sliver of the moonstone. What he saw sent a chill down his spine. Within the crystalline structure, there were inclusions, microscopic structures that resembled organic matter. They pulsed with a faint light, in sync with the phases of the moon displayed on a nearby monitor. A biological component. That was impossible. A figure weren't supposed to have biological components. But there it was, staring him in the face. The moonstone wasn't just a mineral. It was something else entirely, and it was changing them. The moonstone was alive. The moonstone was alive. The hum intensified, resonating deep within Seth's skull. He felt a strange pull, a compulsion to touch the moonstone, to understand its secrets. He resisted the urge, forcing himself to focus on the data. The pieces were starting to come together. The light, the transformations, the hum, the organic inclusions. It all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. The moonstone was alive. And it was reacting to the lunar light, transforming those exposed to it into something else. A flicker of movement in his peripheral vision snapped Seth back to reality. A technician, usually meticulous, was fidgeting, twitching. His eyes darted around the lab, unfocused, wild. "Everything all right?" Seth asked, his voice tight. The technician didn't respond, just continued to twitch. Then, abruptly, he grabbed a wrench from a nearby workbench and hurled it at the containment unit. The reinforced glass held, but the impact reverberated through the lab. Seth lunged forward, grabbing the technician's arm. He felt a surge of unnatural strength as the technician struggled against him, his face contorted in a silent scream. "Restrain him!" Seth yelled. The security chief, who had followed him into the lab, moved quickly, pinning the technician against the wall. The technician's skin seemed to be hardening, taking on a rough, stony texture. He thrashed violently, his eyes glowing with an eerie luminescence. "What's happening to him?" The security chief grunted, struggling to maintain his hold. "The moonstone," Seth said, his voice grim. "It's accelerating the transformation." Suddenly, a piercing alarm blared through the colony. A colleague lights flashed, bathing the lab in an ominous glow. "Breach in Sector 4!" A voice crackled over the comm system. "Containment failure!" Seth repeat, "Containment failure!" Seth felt a cold dread grip his heart. Sector 4. That's where they had secured the transformed colleague. "Seal the lab," Seth ordered. "Now!" He grabbed a pulse rifle from the weapons locker and raced out of the lab, the security chief close behind. The corridor was a scene of chaos. An agent were running in panic, their faces etched with fear. Some clutched at their heads, moaning. Others stumbled, their bodies contorting in grotesque ways. The metallic tang in the air was overwhelming, acrid, and sickening. As they approached Sector 4, they heard a series of crashes and guttural roars. The containment door was buckled and torn, ripped from its frame as if by some monstrous force. Seth raised his rifle, his heart pounding in his chest. A guard the containment area, the transformed colleague was gone. But the walls were covered in strange, iridescent markings. And in the center of the room, a large chunk of raw moonstone pulsed with an unnatural light. "He's heading for the mines," the security chief said, his voice strained. "That's where the main deposits are." Seth nodded grimly. They have to stop him. If he gets to the moonstone, there's no telling what will happen. They moved quickly through the corridors, encountering more and more transformed individuals. Some were docile, lost in their own nightmarish realities. Others were violent, driven by an insatiable hunger for the moonstone. As they rounded a corner, they came face to face with the transformed colleague. He was even more monstrous than before. His limbs were elongated, his skin covered in chitinous plates. His eyes glowed with a malevolent intelligence. He lunged at them, his claws extended. Seth fired his rifle, the pulse rounds ripping through the air. The transformed colleague staggered back, but the wounds seemed to heal almost instantly. He roared, a sound that echoed through the corridors and charged again. The security chief opened fire as well, but it was no use. The transformed colleague was too strong, too fast. He swatted the rifle from Seth's grasp and sent the security chief sprawling. Seth felt a searing pain as the transformed colleague's claws raked across his arm. Blood soaked through the fabric of his suit. He stumbled back, his vision blurring. The transformed colleague loomed over him, his eyes burning with an unholy light. He raised his claws, ready to strike the final blow. Suddenly, a figure lunged from the shadows, tackling the transformed colleague to the ground. It was the officer, the one who had helped the colleague to the bunks. But something was different about him. His eyes glowed with the same eerie light. His movements were unnaturally swift. He was transforming too. The officer and the transformed colleague grappled, their bodies contorting and twisting in a grotesque dance. Seth watched in horror, his mind reeling. The infection was spreading, consuming them all. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone and blood. A low, guttural hum filled the corridors, a symphony of madness and despair. Seth knew, with chilling certainty, that they were running out of time. The transformed colleague roared, a sound that shook the very foundations of the colony. Seth scrambled back, the metallic tang of blood thick in his nostrils. A colleague radiated up his arm from the deep gouges. He had to get up, had to do something. The officer, eyes blazing with that eerie lunar light, was losing ground. The transformed colleague was stronger, his chitinous claws tearing at the officer's suit. A guttural snarl ripped from the transformed colleague's throat as he slammed the officer against the corridor wall. Seth pushed himself up, ignoring the searing pain. He saw his pulse rifle lying a few feet away. He lurched for it, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. Agent as he grasped the weapon. A tremor shook the corridor, throwing him off balance. A guard rained down from the ceiling. He scrambled to his feet, rifle raised. The transformed colleague had pinned the officer, his claws raised for the killing blow. Seth fired. The pulse round slammed into the transformed colleague's back, sending him staggering. He roared in pain and fury, turning his burning gaze on Seth. The officer, momentarily free, scrambled away, his breathing ragged. He looked at Seth, a flicker of something like recognition in his glowing eyes. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, he darted away, disappearing into the shadows. Seth didn't have time to wonder where he was going. The transformed colleague was charging again, his movements faster, more erratic than before. Seth fired again and again, but the pulse rounds seemed to have little effect. He had to get out of the corridor, had to find a way to stop this. He glanced around, searching for an escape route. He spotted a maintenance hatch set into the wall. He didn't know where it led, but it was better than nothing. He fired a final volley at the transformed colleague, then turned and sprinted towards the hatch. He wrestled with the release mechanism, his fingers slick with blood. The transformed colleague was closing in, his heavy footsteps shaking the corridor. Finally, the hatch sprang open. Seth didn't hesitate. He plunged into the darkness, pulling the hatch shut behind him just as the transformed colleague reached it. He heard the creature slam against the metal door, a frustrated roar echoing through the narrow space. He was in a maintenance tunnel, a cramped, claustrophobic space filled with pipes and conduits. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and stale metal. He fumbled for the light switch, and a flickering fluorescent bulb sputtered to life, casting long, distorted shadows. He had to warn everyone, had to find a way to stop the moonstone from transforming them all. But how? He didn't even know how it was happening. He leaned against the cool metal wall, trying to think. Then he remembered the data he had been analyzing. The organic inclusions, the hum, the light. He pulled out his datapad, his fingers trembling as he navigated through the files. He focused on the readings from the environmental sensors. There was a spike in unusual particulate matter whenever the moonstone was exposed to direct lunar light. He cross-referenced that data with the reports of the transformations. A chilling pattern emerged. The transformations only occurred in areas exposed to unfiltered moonlight. And the rate of transformation was directly proportional to the intensity of the light. He scrolled through the geological surveys of the HIs. The main moonstone vein was located deep within the complex, in a section that had been structurally compromised by the mining operations. A section that was now directly exposed to the lunar surface. That was it. The moonstone wasn't just reacting to the light, it was blooming. A figure microscopic spores that were being inhaled or absorbed through the skin. A person that were dormant in artificial light, but activated by the unfiltered lunar rays. He had to warn everyone, had to seal off the moonstone deposits from the moonlight. But how could he do that when the entire complex was bathed in the stuff? Then, a horrifying realization struck him. The colony's core reactor. It was powered by moonstone. And it was slowly irradiating the entire complex with the spores. That was why the transformations were spreading even in areas that weren't directly exposed to the lunar surface. A wave of nausea washed over him. It was all connected. The breach in the HIs, the reactor, the transformations. They were all part of the same terrifying equation. He had to shut down the reactor, had to seal off the HIs. He had to find someone he could trust, someone who wasn't already transformed. He looked at the datapad again. He had to find a way to block the moonlight, to stop the spores from spreading. The colony needed to be sealed from the lunar rays. The colony needed to be dark. He could feel it. The lights flickered again, casting the tunnel into deeper shadow. A low, guttural hum vibrated through the walls. He wasn't alone in the tunnel. He could feel it. He gripped his pulse rifle, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to move, had to find a way out. He started running deeper into the darkness, the hum growing louder with every step. The tunnel twisted and turned, a maze of pipes and conduits. The air grew heavy, thick with a cloying sweetness that stung his nostrils. He risked a glance behind him. A dark shape was emerging from the shadows, its form shifting and indistinct. The transformed colleague. It moved with a disturbing fluidity, its limbs contorting in unnatural ways. He pressed on, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He reached a junction, 2 tunnels stretching before him into the darkness. He hesitated, unsure which way to go. The hum was growing louder, closer. He chose the left tunnel, sprinting as fast as he could. He stumbled, his foot catching on a loose cable. He went down hard, the rifle flying from his grasp. A colleague shot up his arm from the impact. He scrambled to his feet, his vision swimming. The transformed colleague was almost upon him, its shadow looming over him. He lunged for the rifle, his fingers closing around the cold metal just as the transformed colleague swiped at him. A searing pain ripped across his chest. He stumbled back, clutching at the wound. Blood soaked through his suit. He raised the rifle, firing blindly into the darkness. The pulse round slammed into the transformed colleague, sending it staggering back with a screech. He didn't wait to see if it was down. He turned and ran, his chest burning with every breath. He didn't stop until he reached a dead end, a solid metal wall blocking his path. He leaned against the wall, gasping for air. He was trapped. The hum was deafening now, filling his head with a nauseating vibration. He turned to face his pursuer. The transformed colleague stood at the entrance to the tunnel, its form now clearly visible in the flickering light. Its skin was a sickly green color, covered in pulsating veins. Its eyes glowed with an eerie lunar light. Claws, sharp and black, extended from its fingers. But it was its head that was truly horrifying. The skull was elongated, distorted, with a series of bony ridges running down its length. And from its mouth came not a roar, but a whisper. "Join. Them." The whisper was inside his head, a cold, alien presence invading his thoughts. He recoiled, clutching his head in his hands. The moonstone. Calls. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the voice. But it was no use. It was inside him now, a seed of madness taking root in his mind. He opened his eyes, his gaze locking with those glowing eyes. He could see something in them, something beyond the madness and the transformation. A flicker of the officer. Help! Him! The whisper was weaker now, tinged with pain and desperation. He lowered his rifle, his hand trembling. There is still time. The transformed colleague took a step forward, its claws outstretched. He didn't flinch. He stared into those eyes, searching for any sign of the man he once knew. Seal. The light. The whisper faded, replaced by a guttural snarl. The officer was gone, consumed by the transformation. The transformed colleague lunged, its claws aimed at his throat. He raised his rifle, firing a single shot. The pulse round hit the transformed colleague square in the chest, sending it crashing to the ground. It lay there, twitching, its eyes still glowing with that eerie light. He stood over it, his chest heaving, his body trembling. He had to get out of here, had to warn the others. He turned and ran back the way he came, the whispers echoing in his head. He had to seal off the his, but he couldn't do it alone. He reached the junction again, pausing to catch his breath. He had to find someone he could trust. He chose the other tunnel, running blindly into the darkness. The air grew colder, the smell of ozone stronger. He could hear the faint sound of dripping water. He rounded a corner and saw a faint light ahead. He approached cautiously, his rifle raised. The tunnel opened into a small chamber. A lone figure stood in the center of the chamber, silhouetted against the light. A technician, working on a console, back turned to Seth. The air tasted metallic, and the light had a disturbing greenish tint. The technician turned. "I need your help," Seth said, his voice hoarse. The technician turned. The technician's eyes were glowing with that eerie lunar light. A wave of nausea washed over him. Betrayal, bitter and sharp, coated his tongue. He should have known. A colleague was a luxury he couldn't afford. The air hung thick and still, the metallic tang stinging his nostrils. He raised the pulse rifle, his hands shaking. "What have you done?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The technician didn't answer. A slow smile spread across their features, a grotesque parody of human expression. "They are becoming." The voice was a distorted echo, layered with a chilling resonance. Becoming? The word resonated in Seth's mind, a horrifying puzzle piece sliding into place. The transformations. They weren't random mutations. They were deliberate, a process of assimilation. He remembered the whispers, the hallucinations, the feeling of something alien invading his thoughts. He fired. The pulse round struck the technician in the chest, throwing them back against the console. An agent flew. The chamber plunged into momentary darkness. When the lights flickered back on, the technician was gone. A guard, a dark stain remained on the console, a pulsating mass of green veins spreading like a malignant growth. He took a step back, his mind reeling. The moonstone wasn't just a mineral. It was something else. Something alive. And the moon's light was its catalyst, the key to its horrifying transformation. He could feel the hum now, vibrating through the floor, resonating in his bones. It wasn't just a sound. It was a signal, a call. He had to get out of here. He had to warn the others, if there were any others left to warn. He turned to leave, but the tunnel behind him was gone, replaced by a solid wall of rock. He was trapped. The chamber began to shift, the walls pulsating with an unnatural rhythm. The console in front of him morphed, its metal surface softening, becoming organic. A figure vein snaked across its surface, connecting to the pulsating mass where the technician had stood. The light grew brighter, bathing the chamber in an eerie green glow. He felt a searing pain in his head, a pressure building behind his eyes. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. Join. Them. He squeezed his eyes shut, clamping his hands over his ears. But the whispers were inside him, in his mind. He could feel the moonstone's influence, a cold, alien presence trying to take root. He stumbled back, his vision blurring. He could see images flashing before his eyes, visions of a vast alien landscape, a world bathed in the light of a dying star. He saw towering structures of bone and crystal, pulsating with a sickly green light. He saw creatures, grotesque and alien, moving with a disturbing fluidity. And at the center of it all, he saw it. The source. A massive pulsating heart buried deep within the moon's crust. The original moonstone bloom. It pumped spores throughout the tunnels, infecting everything it touched. He understood now. The moonstone wasn't just replicating itself. It was expanding, growing, assimilating. It was using the colonists as hosts, transforming them into new forms to spread its influence. The whispers weren't just psychological. They were the moonstone's attempt to communicate, to guide, to control. He had to destroy it. He had to find a way to stop the moonstone before it consumed everything. He opened his eyes, his gaze hardening. The technician, or what was left of them, was reforming in front of him, the green veins coalescing into a grotesque mockery of a human form. "You cannot resist," the transformed technician hissed, its voice a chorus of alien whispers. "They are inevitable." He raised his pulse rifle, his hand steady now. He knew what he had to do. He had to find the original bloom, the heart of the moonstone. He fired. The pulse rounds tore through the transformed technician, ripping it apart. But he knew it wouldn't be enough. The moonstone was everywhere, in the walls, in the air, in his mind. He had to escape. He had to find a way out of this nightmare. He turned and ran, deeper into the chamber, searching for any sign of an exit. The walls pulsed around him, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. He could feel the moonstone closing in, trying to trap him, to assimilate him. He stumbled upon a small vent, barely large enough to crawl through. It was his only chance. He squeezed through the opening, the metal scraping against his suit. He didn't know where it led, but it was better than staying here. He crawled through the vent, the whispers echoing in his head. He had to shut down the reactor. He had to stop the moonstone. But he couldn't do it alone. A colleague through the vent, the metal edges bit into his suit. The whispers clawed at his mind, a chorus of alien voices urging him to surrender. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block them out, focusing on the scrape of metal against his armor, the grit of dust filling the air. He had to seal off the light. He had to shut down the reactor. He had to stop the moonstone. But he couldn't do it alone. The vent twisted and turned, a claustrophobic maze that seemed to stretch on forever. He pushed forward, driven by a primal urge to survive, to fight back against the encroaching darkness. The air grew thick and heavy, the metallic tang intensifying, mingling with a strange, sickly sweet odor that made his stomach churn. The whispers intensified, becoming a cacophony of alien tongues. He emerged into a larger chamber, blinking against the dim, flickering lights. The walls were lined with consoles, their screens dark and lifeless. A low hum vibrated through the floor, resonating in his bones. He was in the reactor control room. He spotted a figure slumped against a console, their form distorted and grotesque. A technician, or what was left of one. The technician's skin was stretched and translucent, the green veins pulsating beneath the surface. The technician turned, its eyes glowing with that eerie lunar light. "You cannot escape," the transformed technician hissed, its voice a distorted echo. "They are everywhere." Seth raised his pulse rifle, his hands shaking. "Where is the reactor core?" he demanded, his voice barely a whisper. The transformed technician laughed, a chilling, discordant sound. "It is all connected," the transformed technician said. "They are all part of it." Seth fired. The pulse rounds tore through the transformed technician, sending it sprawling. He didn't have time to waste. He had to find the reactor core, the source of the light that was fueling the Moonstone's transformation. He scanned the consoles, searching for the main power controls. The symbols were alien, indecipherable. He didn't understand any of this. An agent threatened to overwhelm him. Then he saw it. A small, unassuming panel, hidden beneath a layer of dust. He brushed it clean, revealing a series of buttons and switches. He didn't know what they did, but he had to try. He flipped a switch. The lights flickered, then died, plunging the chamber into darkness. The hum intensified, growing into a deafening roar. He could feel the Moonstone's presence, a cold, alien force pressing against his mind. He scrambled for another switch, his fingers fumbling in the darkness. He found it, a large red button labeled Emergency Shutdown. He hesitated for a moment, then slammed his fist down on the button. The roar subsided, replaced by an eerie silence. The Moonstone's presence receded, but it didn't disappear. It was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. He fumbled for his flashlight, switching it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the chamber. The consoles were dead, the screens blank. The reactor was shut down. But it wasn't enough. He could still feel the Moonstone's influence, the whispers still echoing in his head. He remembered the engineer's words, the plan to collapse the hives with explosives. It was a desperate gamble, but it was their only chance. He had to find the others. He had to find the explosives. He stumbled out of the reactor control room, back into the vent. The tunnel was darker now, the whispers louder, more insistent. He crawled through the vent, driven by a newfound sense of purpose. He emerged into a larger chamber, the main mining tunnel. The air was thick with dust, the smell of decay heavy in the air. He spotted two figures huddled in the shadows, a guard and an officer. They were alive. "They have to move," Seth said, his voice hoarse. "They have to find the explosives." The officer nodded, their face grim. "They know where they are," the officer said, "but it's heavily guarded." "They don't have a choice," Seth said. "This is their last stand." They moved through the tunnels, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The Moonstone's influence grew stronger, the whispers more insistent. They could feel it closing in, trying to trap them, to assimilate them. They reached the storage chamber, the entrance blocked by a group of transformed guards. The guards' eyes glowed with that eerie lunar light, their bodies twisted and grotesque. "You cannot pass," the transformed guard hissed, their voices a chorus of alien whispers. "They are inevitable." Seth raised his pulse rifle, his hand steady. "They're not giving up," he said. "They're going to destroy you all." The battle began. A guard rounds tore through the air, striking the transformed guards. The guards returned fire, their weapons spitting bolts of energy. Seth fought with a ferocity he didn't know he possessed. He had to protect the others. He had to destroy the Moonstone. He had to save what was left of the colony. The officer and the guard fought bravely, but they were outnumbered. One by one, they fell, their bodies twisted and broken. Seth was the only one left standing. He was wounded, exhausted, but he refused to surrender. He had come too far. He charged forward, firing his pulse rifle. The transformed guards fell before him, their bodies collapsing into grotesque heaps. He reached the storage chamber, the explosives within his grasp. He grabbed the detonator, his fingers trembling. He knew what he had to do. He had to destroy the original Bloom, even if it meant sacrificing himself. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and pressed the button. The world exploded, the world exploded. A wave of heat slammed into Seth, throwing him against the far wall of the storage chamber. A colleague and debris rained down, filling his lungs, choking him. He coughed, sputtering, trying to clear his vision. The storage chamber had collapsed, burying the transformed guards under tons of rock and metal. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the pain that shot through his leg. The tunnel was unstable, the ceiling groaning under the strain. He had to get out. He stumbled through the wreckage, back toward the main mining tunnel. The whispers were a deafening roar now, pressing against his mind, threatening to overwhelm him. He squeezed his eyes shut, focusing on the feel of the rock beneath his hands, the grit of dust between his teeth. He had to keep moving. The tunnel twisted and turned, a labyrinth of crumbling rock and twisted metal. He could hear the colony collapsing around him, the groans and creaks of a dying structure. He reached the main access tunnel, the one that led to the surface. It was partially blocked by debris, but he managed to squeeze through. The access tunnel was dark, the emergency lights flickering erratically. He could feel the Moonstone's presence, a cold, alien force that seemed to permeate everything. He stumbled forward, driven by a primal urge to escape. He reached the elevator shaft, the one that led to the surface. The elevator car was gone, destroyed in the explosion. He stared up at the long, dark shaft, his heart sinking. He was trapped. Then he saw it. A maintenance ladder clinging to the side of the shaft. It was a long shot, but it was his only chance. He started to climb, his hands slipping on the metal rungs. The ladder swayed precariously, threatening to throw him into the darkness below. He ignored the fear, focusing on the next rung, the next handhold. He climbed for what seemed like an eternity, his muscles screaming in protest. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, trying to lure him back into the darkness. He squeezed his eyes shut, blocking them out, focusing on the scrape of metal against his gloves, the burn in his lungs. Finally, he reached the top of the shaft. He pulled himself over the edge, collapsing onto the surface. He lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, his body trembling with exhaustion. The lunar surface was bathed in the eerie glow of the transformed moon. The ground felt different, vibrating with a strange, alien energy. He stood up, his legs wobbly. He had to reach the escape pod, the one they had prepared for emergencies. It was located on the far side of the mine.